So I wanted to touch base. I had spoken 4 weeks ago in the first devotion about making our resolutions to be knowing Jesus Christ and Him crucified, as Paul had said. And I want to kind of take another step in that direction and mention something that I think really gets in the way of knowing Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And a big thing that gets in the way of us really knowing Christ and experiencing Him on a personal level is distraction. And chief among those distractions is really this distraction of self. And I'll get into what I kind of mean by that. There's this phenomenon in philosophy, or actually you may have noticed this phenomenon in your own life. It's called the cocktail party effect. And what it is suppose you're in this crowded room at a cocktail party, and there's all these people surrounding you, there's a loud noise in the room, but yet somebody from way across the room can say your name, and amidst all of this noise, you can pick out that noise, those distinct auditory patterns, even though it's at the same decibel level as all the other noise in the room. Somehow you can hear your own name being said across the other room. This is called the cocktail party effect. This is because we pick up on things that are important to us, particularly our own names. And this correlates to the message that I shared this past weekend of how we place importance on names, and particularly our own. We get attached to them. We like things that begin with the first letters of our names. So if you were to pick your top 10 favorite letters of the alphabet, chances are amidst those top 10, one of them would be the first letter of your first name. And this is interesting because it correlates to this idea of self, and what we kind of how our view of self taints or colors the way that we perceive the world. And there's this other idea in philosophy. It's called the phaneron, and I know it's this fancy word, but it's just really describes the sum total of all sensory experience in the mind. So really, it's the phaneron explains the world as your mind perceives it. Whether or not that relates to anything that's actually real, the phaneron is how you perceive the world. So it's really your perception. And many times we have this perception of self that kind of twists the way that we view the world, and that gets in the way of our spiritual perceptions as well. Did you know that you have not only just your five senses, actually we have a lot more than five senses that are physical, but we have spiritual senses as well. And if we're not feeding those spiritual senses, if we're not attuned to spiritual senses, then it's just like any other sense, it's going to diminish over time. This is why when, before you received Christ, before you became a believer, or if you're not a believer right now, you don't really have this sense of the spiritual, because for all intents and purposes, it is not active. For all intents and purposes, it's dead. And this is what the Bible talks about as spiritual death. We don't have the senses of the spiritual. So part of what gets in the way of us knowing Jesus Christ and Him crucified is getting over ourself. And really, so what I want to read to you is just some quotes from some good thinkers, men who are far more intellectual and far more spiritually inclined than myself. And they really have some good things to say about what's called this weed of self. For example, A.W. Tozer says that self is one of the toughest plants that grows in the garden of life. It is, in fact, indestructible by any human means. Just when we are sure it is dead, it turns up somewhere as robust as ever to trouble our peace and poison the fruit of our lives. Francis Fenelon says, a man's self is his greatest cross. Nathaniel Hawthorne says, what other dungeon is so dark as one's own heart? What jailer is so inexorable as one's self? There's a Latin proverb that says, self-praise is no recommendation. Bishop Joseph Butler says, self-love is a medium of a peculiar kind. It magnifies everything that is amiss in others at the same time that it lessens everything that is amiss in ourselves. And I'll leave you with one from C.S. Lewis. It says, a proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't see something that is above you. See, Jesus Christ is God incarnate. He is so far above us. And as long as we are looking down, as long as we're looking inward at ourselves, we're so wrapped up in our day-to-day lives, we're so wrapped up in our own perception of the world that we don't stop to think what would Jesus think about this? Then that gets in the way of us really knowing him, really experiencing him in the way that he would like us to. The Bible is rich with language that is physical language of how we can experience God. We read verses such as, taste and see that the Lord is good. You're employing your senses to really experience God. But when we are preoccupied with just what's in front of us, then we miss so much more of what God wants us to see and experience. So my challenge would be to get out of ourselves a little bit, to step out of that. One of the greatest things to do is look for ways to help other people. Servanthood is a fantastic way that you can help other people who really need it. You really do some real good, but it's also a great way to step out of yourself, and a great way when we do that, we can experience Jesus in that way.